For Becca's peace of mind, maybe you shouldn't show up. That was the sentence, not a question, not even a plea necessarily. Just a nice little sentence of judgment masquerading as fake concern deposited 3 paragraphs down from the top of my mum's email as if it was part of the notes for the catering. I read it the words in that snappy office red font that always came from her like she was writing from a desk job and not from inside her daughter. I did not freak out. I did not break down or slam shut the laptop angrily or call demanding what was so wrong with her. I sat there with a silence that grew in my apartment, my hand resting on top of the trackpad, as if perhaps if I remained motionless somehow, that sentence would delete itself. But it didn't. It just sat there, silent and definitive, a virtual erasing of myself from a wedding that I was part of helping to create. My throat was dry. I blinked once, very slowly. Then I closed the laptop. I remember that silence more than anything. It was a silence that does not console, it confirms. I stood up out of there, headed to the kitchen, and made myself a glass of water that I didn't want. My face in that microwave door was abnormally serene, not shattered, not shocked, just frozen. I drank that water and tried to remind myself that that was not exactly the first time that I was asked to become invisible for someone's benefit. Once upon a time, I cancelled a trip to Puerto Rico when Becca developed a tummy ache a couple of days before I was supposed to leave. Mum called tears streaming down her face, saying that she was exhausted, that Becca was so dramatic when sick, and couldn't I just show up for the weekend I hadn't even paused. I rebooked that flight and showed up with soup. Becca barely even noticed me naturally, yet I remember Mum saying, "You're so good for a sister," as if that was a badge that I was supposed to pin myself rather than an injury. I booked the flight to Santa Fe 2 hours later. No bother. A cursor blinks in a search bar, a confirming page. It was a late flight cheaper, less populated. The kind of trip you make when you don't want to be seen. Out of the plane window, it was snowing heavy and intentional, like it had no other place it needed to be. I didn't pack much. Only notebooks, a couple of sweaters, my sketchbook, and the letter from Dad hidden behind an old bookmark. I hadn't read it in years, not since the week after his funeral. I don't know why I brought it again this time. Maybe some part of me understood that this trip was more than missing a wedding. It was about mourning for something more. On board, I sat alone. I watched the snow track down along the length of the tarmac while we taxiing out. There was a kind of way to nighttime flights that made everything more honest. Everyone was spent, no one was pretending. I leaned my forehead up against the glass and wondered about Dad. He never shouted, but it would hit. Once in an argument with my family, when Becca and Margot had flat out talked me out of everything I was saying, I remember getting out onto the porch in a fit. My dad stood with one hand propped on the railing next to me and said, "You don't need to yell to be heard, Eleanor." I was 16. I did not believe him then. I don't think a part of me believes it now. Because yelling isn't quite my style, but silence has certainly never gotten a seat at table either. I looked down at the boarding pass in my lap, my name neatly printed in it. That's the point, isn't it? My name was on that ticket, on my lease, on the utility statements, but not on the bridal party list, not on the seating chart, not in my mother's definition of who was invited. It's strange that absence of being there can be more present than anything. The flight attendant brought tea. I got it from her, nodded, then wrapped both hands around the paper cup just to grasp warmth. The sky out there was as black as coal pitch, no stars, only from time to time a shiver of turbulence below us. Would Becca even notice I was missing? Would Mum say I was dramatic, or finally admit that she desired a simple wedding with 2 daughters? Easy, easier, clean. I didn't respond, not even a thanks for letting me know. There's no point in arguing with one who has redone the work without you. In any case, she hadn't exactly given any room for comment. Only details, bullet points, a final sentence that stung as if etched with a scalpel. Or maybe you shouldn't even appear? I sat staring out of the window until the sky was no longer black, but a cold charcoal grey. Above the Midwest somewhere, I closed my eyes not to sleep, but to become invisible for a moment. Somewhere I couldn't be erased. That phrase lingered in my mind even after I landed in Santa Fe. The cabin I'd rented was tucked behind a grove of bare aspens, silent except for the crunch of old snow beneath my boots. It took 3 full hours before I even thought about checking my phone again. I didn't. Instead, I unpacked 1 bag, made tea, and sat with my notebook flipping through old pages. At some point, I found a rough sketch of 3 girls, 1 tall and stiff-backed one, slouching with headphones, and the last one in the middle hands in her pockets, like she wasn't sure whether to lean in or drift out. I had drawn it years ago during a Thanksgiving, where everything looked perfect on the table but tasted off. That was us. Margot, the firstborn, born polished. She was the reliable one, the one with the full scholarship, the law degree, the fiancé who wore beige sweaters and said things like mileage points. She never forgot a birthday, always replied to group chats, and somehow made being basic look like a flex. Mum adored her, still does. You can hear it in the way she says her name first at every dinner. Margot, would you like to say Grace? Margot, how's the job? Margot, you always know what's best. Every meal was a hierarchy, and Margot always got the opening line. Becca the baby, the chaos and glitter. She was messy, loud, emotional, but charming in that way people forgive. She cried easily and laughed even easier. She made messes, but made them look like art. And me, I was the bridge, the buffer. I was the one who held her hair back when she drank too much in high school, who edited her captions when she started her influencer account, who bought her first camera set with my freelance paycheck and told her, you have something real. Just don't fake it. She faked it anyway. But she was good at it. So good that people started paying her to be someone she barely knew how to be. I watched her build a brand off vulnerability and self-love while cutting off the one person who loved her when she had nothing to brand. In every podcast, every feature, every teary-eyed Q&A, Becca thanked her followers, her manager, even her dog, but never me. Not once. No thanks to my sister who helped me start this. Not even in the fine print. I wasn't bitter, not in the loud way. I just learned to stop expecting my name in the credits. That's a lesson you learn in our family early. Your worth is quieter than your absence. I remember one dinner when I had just come back from a writing retreat. I'd gotten published in a small journal for the first time. I told Mum about it, excited, hopeful in that stupid childlike way. She smiled, nodded, then turned to Margot. Didn't you win some essay contest back in high school too? That was it. A redirect. A spotlight pulled away like it was never mine to begin with. Later that night, I found myself reaching for Dad's old spoon, the one with the slight bend in the handle from years of use. He used to say it tasted better than the others. I always believed him. After he died, I started using it during dinners quietly. No one noticed. That's how grief works in this family. It's quiet, personal, and preferably not discussed. It wasn't always like that. When I was 14, Dad took me to see Finding Forrester. It wasn't a big deal, just one of those random Saturdays when the other girls were busy, but I remember every detail. The way he said, "You're the writer, you'll get this." The popcorn too salty. The silence in the car after full but comfortable. He didn't say much, just handed me a notebook when we got home and said, "Start." That night I did. I wrote 2 pages of nothing special, but it was the first time I believed I might have something worth saying. After he passed, no one ever asked if I was still writing. They asked about jobs, about stability, about whether I was doing okay. The answer was always the same, sure. Fine. Whatever kept them from looking too close. From remembering that the middle daughter was still there, still trying to be more than a buffer. In the cabin, the snow started again. I held Dad's spoon in one hand and my tea in the other. It was quiet, peaceful maybe, but mostly empty. Not the bad kind, just still, like something was waiting. Maybe not a moment, maybe just me. I don't remember the exact day the bridal party list came out, only the feeling. That subtle drop in my stomach like missing a stair. It wasn't even sent to me. Margot forwarded it in a group thread with a dozen exclamation points and a photo of her dress swatch. I opened the attachment more out of habit than curiosity. I already knew. But reading it confirmed the thing I'd been pretending I could still unfeel I wasn't on it. No Eleanor, maid of honour. No Eleanor anything. Just Margot as matron of honour, 2 college friends from Becca's sorority, and 1 girl I vaguely remembered from a yoga retreat in Tulum. 4 smiling faces on a pastel-coloured PDF, none of them mine. My first reaction wasn't rage, it was confusion. Not at Becca, really. At myself. For believing the promise she made when we were younger, when I braided her hair before school, and she whispered, "You'll always be the one standing next to me." We were in high school, I think. She had just broken up with her first boyfriend, and I brought her mint chip ice cream. She cried into my hoodie and said if she ever got married, I'd be the one holding her bouquet. I should have known better than to hold her to anything said between sobs and sugar. Still, I asked. I sent Mum a quiet message, 1 line. "Was my name left off by mistake?" She replied a few hours later. "You understand, right? No explanation, no accountability. Just that familiar, condescending assumption that I'd take the high road. Again. That I'd do what I always did, swallow the slight and smile through the speech. But this time, there wasn't a speech. At least not one that would be heard. I had written one, of course. Becca asked me 2 months earlier. She said, "Make it emotional, but polished. Not too quirky, remember the brand." I'd sent her a draft. It had stories from our childhood, little inside jokes, a line about how her laugh could pull people out of the darkest moods. She replied with thanks. I'll have my team tweak it a bit. The version that ended up on her wedding website read like a Pinterest caption. No soul, no truth, definitely no trace of me. I remember holding the crumpled draft in my hand standing by my desk. I didn't throw it away. I just folded it smaller and smaller until it was a tight little square and shoved it in the bottom drawer. Like if I buried it, the rest wouldn't sting so much. But it did. It always does. That wasn't the first thing I wrote that never got read. After Dad died, I tried writing a letter to Mum. I was 19. I was home from college for the weekend, and the house was heavy in that way. Only grief and tension can make it. I couldn't say what I needed to her face, so I wrote. Pages and pages about feeling invisible, about how every dinner felt like a performance, about how I didn't know where I fit anymore now that the one person who saw me was gone. I never gave it to her. I kept it folded in the back of a book she never read. Some part of me thought she might find it one day and finally understand. She never did. Or maybe she did and decided not to say anything. That's more her style. I opened my laptop again, not to check emails this time, but to check flights. No more waiting for polite dismissals. No more decoding passive-aggressive RSVP lists. Just action. I clicked through tabs like it was muscle memory. Picked a date. Picked a place. Santa Fe sounded far enough. Close enough. Quiet. The confirmation page blinked in front of me. I didn't feel vindicated, just tired. The kind of tired that lives under your ribs, that hums even when you sleep. That night, I lay on the cabin bed, staring at the beams in the ceiling, thinking about Becca's bachelorette trip. She'd posted a reel of its champagne glitter hats, a beach I couldn't name. I'd messaged her a heart emoji. She never replied. The next day, she posted a thank you note to her ride or die crew and tagged everyone but me. A notification buzzed on my phone from a mutual friend. Didn't think you'd skip this one. I didn't reply. I just opened that bottom drawer, took out the tiny crumpled speech draft, and pressed it flat on the desk. It still had my handwriting, still had a part of me. At least something did. The wind outside had picked up slow and whispery brushing, snow against the cabin windows like a soft knock. I moved to the couch by the fireplace, lit a log with the matches Ruth had left in a mason jar, and watched as it cracked to life. Everything in this cabin seemed made to hold silence. Not the suffocating kind, but the type that gives space back to you. The type that says you're allowed to rest here. I pulled my journal from my bag and started sketching lines. First, then, shading the muscle memory of years ago, returning without effort. I drew the sidewalk in front of our old house, me and Becca playing with chalk and the crooked tree Dad once tried to straighten with rope and optimism. Then, another scene, Mom, standing by the kitchen counter, arms crossed, eyes sharp. I was maybe 17 in the memory, holding the acceptance letter to a writing program I'd applied to in secret. She'd read the letter, then laughed once short and flat and said, "You're smart, Elena. Don't waste it on something that won't feed you." I'd hidden the application after that. Said I never finished it. She never asked again. In the firelight, I sketched her silhouette without a face, just posture. That's what I remembered most, her posture, when she decided I was making a mistake. As I flipped through the journal's back pocket, something fell out. A folded piece of paper, yellowing at the edges. My breath caught before I even unfolded it. The letter, the one I wrote to her after Dad died. I had forgotten I tucked it there. The handwriting was uneven, a little shaky. I read the first line. "I know you miss him too, but sometimes I feel like you forgot me in the process." It wasn't poetic, just raw. I told her how invisible I felt in the months after the funeral, how loud the house had become in its silence, how I was tired of earning her affection in fractions. I hadn't even signed it. I remember thinking she wouldn't care either way. I pressed it flat on the coffee table beside my sketchbook and stared at both like they might speak back. That's when I noticed something else beneath the lining of my duffel bag. Tucked in the inner pocket I rarely used. A smaller envelope sealed. My name written in Dad's handwriting. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up. I didn't open it right away. I just held it against my chest as if his words might seep through the paper and tell me what to do next. Later, when the fire was dimming, I opened it. The letter was short, just a few lines. He'd written it during the final weeks, the ones where his voice was mostly gone and his hands trembled. If you're ever excluded from a celebration you helped build, maybe the party was flawed from the start. That was the line. No signature, no moral, just that. like he already knew what would come. I didn't cry. I just folded the letter and placed it gently between the pages of my journal. Around midnight, Ruth knocked softly and let herself in. She told me she was next door in the adjoining cabin, just in case I needed anything. She wore a thick cardigan and carried a thermos. Chamomile, she said, and a little honey. No pressure to talk. We sat by the fire, not saying much for a while. Then she noticed the unfinished blanket draped over the rocking chair. Started that for someone once, she said. Didn't end up staying. She didn't elaborate, but I knew what she meant. That kind of heartbreak, the one where you shrink yourself to fit someone else's mould, leaves loose threads. She looked at me with quiet understanding. I spent years trying to please my mother, she added. Left a woman I loved to make things easier. Funny thing is, it never made anything easier, just lonelier. I nodded. Mine told me writing was foolish. She sipped her tea. So, write foolishly. Then keep writing. It was the first time in weeks I felt seen, not because she understood every part of me, just because she didn't try to reshape it. When she left, I wrapped the unfinished blanket around my shoulders and watched the fire until the embers turned quiet. The wind had stopped. The snow outside was still falling, but slower now, less like a storm and more like a hush, the kind of quiet that made memories louder. I wrapped the unfinished blanket tighter around my shoulders and walked over to the little writing desk by the window. The journal lay open, half filled with sketches, fragments of the unsent letter to my mother, and Dad's last words on paper. I picked up his fountain pen again, held it for a second like it might recognise me. That pen had followed him everywhere. Business trips, parent-teacher meetings, Sunday crossword puzzles. It was never about the object, really. It was about what it meant that he paid attention. He always noticed things, my doodles in the margins, my nervous fidgeting when I wanted to speak, but didn't. He never rushed me. When I brought home a C in math, he didn't flinch. He looked at the comments on the back and said, "You worked hard. I'm proud of that." I didn't realise until years later how rare that kind of response was. He never needed perfection to offer praise, just effort, just me showing up. I remember once in 8th grade, I lost a citywide poetry contest. I'd worked for weeks on it, stayed up past midnight for nights in a row, even missed a school dance to finish my final draft. When the results came in, I placed nowhere. Mum called it a waste of time. "You embarrassed yourself," she said. "Next time, write something people understand." I remember standing there in the kitchen, clutching the rejection email like it might still turn into something else if I stared long enough. Dad walked in, took one look at me and pulled me into a hug. "So, you didn't win?" he said. "You still wrote something beautiful. That counts." Later that night, he sat with me at the kitchen table and helped me go over my lines again. Not to fix them, just to remind me why I started. "Keep writing," he told me, "even if you get it wrong." That sentence stayed with me long after the ink faded. After he died, I stopped hearing it, not because I forgot, but because it felt like it belonged to a world that no longer existed. A world where someone looked at me and saw more than a role to fill. After the funeral, people told me to be strong. Be reliable. Be like Margot. No one asked what I needed. No one noticed how my voice got smaller. I learned to silence myself before anyone else could. It felt safer that way. But silence has a weight to it, one that gathers over time. You think you're lightening the load for everyone else, but really you're burying yourself. I think Dad knew that about me, that I was always going to be the one who internalized too much, made space for others without checking if I had any left for myself. I looked down at the fountain pen, tapped it gently against the paper. The ink flowed instantly, no hesitation. I wrote, "I'm trying." It wasn't much, but it was honest. I added another line, "I still hear you sometimes." Outside, the snow piled softly on the windowsill, like it was trying not to disturb anything. I thought about the time Dad surprised me with a copy of Bird by Bird after I'd mentioned it once in passing. He didn't just hand it to me. He wrote inside the cover, "Because your words matter to me always." I still had that book somewhere, probably in a box in the back of my closet, but the message lived here, in my hand, in this cabin, in this moment where nothing needed to be fixed, only felt. I closed the notebook, let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, and whispered into the quiet room. "Thank you," not because I needed closure, but because even in his absence, he had left me something intact. The belief that I didn't have to be extraordinary to be loved. Just present. Just real. And maybe that was enough. The next morning, Ruth came by with a basket of fresh rolls and marmalade, like she'd always known how to break silence gently. She placed the basket down and looked around the room, pausing for a second on the open notebook on the table, the pen resting beside it. "Sleep? Okay?" she asked. I nodded. "Better than expected." She poured us both tea from the same thermos she'd brought the night before. The chamomile had cooled, but the sweetness lingered. After a few minutes, she said almost in passing, "Do you ever ask yourself what you want? Not what's expected of you. Not what keeps everyone else happy. Just you." I didn't answer. I stared at the steam curling up from the mug. Ruth didn't press. She just added, "It's a question I avoided for too long. By the time I asked it, the answer didn't matter anymore." I looked at her. She met my eyes without judgment. "I once wrote a letter," she continued, "to a friend. The kind of friend you never quite let go of even when you pretend you did. I never sent it. Didn't think it would change anything." "Why not?" I asked. She smiled a little sad. "Because admitting I still needed her would have meant admitting I spent my whole life choosing someone else's version of me." She reached into her coat pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. "I carry it with me. Not to remember her, to remember myself." I opened it slowly. It wasn't long, just a few lines about a shared trip to Paris, how Ruth had wished she'd asked her to stay, how she still dreamt about her laughter in the Louvre gift shop. It was raw, vulnerable, filled with the kind of honesty people save for when they think no one's listening. I handed it back gently. Ruth sipped her tea and said, "You don't have to send the letter, but write it anyway." That afternoon, I sat back at the desk and opened my journal to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote, "Times I was quietly erased." The list came faster than I expected. The school play where I got cast as tree number 3 because Mum said leads were too distracting from grades. The time Becca borrowed my poem and won an award, I clapped from the back row while she thanked our cousin for the inspiration. The moment I gave Becca her first lipstick, a soft rose shade I'd saved allowance for. She'd looked at it and laughed. "It's so outdated. No one wears this colour anymore." She gave it to a friend a week later. I pretended not to notice. I kept writing, page after page, no commentary, just documentation, each memory like a paper cut small, but sharp and undeniable. The air in the cabin smelled faintly of cinnamon, but underneath it I caught a trace of something sharper, the perfume my mother wore. I hadn't brought it, but it lived in the fabric of my memory so strong I could almost feel it sting behind my eyes. That scent had always been more weapon than comfort. a presence that arrived before she did and lingered long after she left. Ruth came in quietly in the evening, carrying a new log for the fire. She saw the pages spread across the desk and smiled. "That's a start," she said. "Now, write from there." I looked up. "Write whatever they told you wasn't worth saying." Her voice was calm but steady. "Write the version of your story where you don't disappear." I didn't reply. I just nodded. Because somewhere between the snowfall and the silence, I had finally begun to hear myself again. The next morning, I woke up to 3 missed calls and 5 unread messages. 1 from Margot, 4 from my mother, all time-stamped between 6:00 and 7:30 a.m. No emojis, no pleasantries, just, "We need to talk. Please respond. Call us now." I didn't. I left the phone face down on the kitchen table and wrapped myself in the same old sweater I'd worn since college. It had a small hole near the left elbow, one I kept meaning to stitch, but never did. It used to belong to Dad. He wore it on snow days, and it still smelled faintly of cedar and worn cotton. Outside, the snow was falling steadily, soft flakes collecting in slow drifts across the porch. The world felt suspended, like time itself had paused for breath. I sat by the window, watching it all unfold in quiet white silence. I remembered walking Becca to school when we were little, her hand in mine, her backpack bigger than she was. She used to skip every third step and hum some off-key tune she made up on the spot. One morning she fell and scraped her knee. Her tights tore and blood dripped onto the snow. She cried the whole way home, terrified not of the pain, but of what Mom would say about ruining another pair. I had told her I'd take the blame, said it was my idea to race. She looked at me like I'd just offered her a lifeboat. That afternoon, I gave her the last of my sticker collection, the good ones, from the Lisa Frank pack. She never mentioned the tights again. We never talked about that day. But after that, she always reached for my hand when the snow got deep. I sipped my tea and watched the flakes gather on the windowsill. The cabin creaked with the weight of the wind, but inside it was still, peaceful in a way that felt earned. A knock at the door broke the quiet. I opened it to find a small girl no older than 7, bundled in mismatched layers and a hat too big for her head. She looked up at me, eyes wide. "I lost my dog," she said, holding up a leash with no dog on it. I stepped outside, pulling my coat around me. "What's his name? Pickle," she said. "He's a dachshund." He ran into the trees. I walked with her down the path, snow crunching beneath our boots. She kept glancing over like she wasn't sure if I was real. "You live in the writer's house?" she asked. "I guess I do," I said. "Do you write stories?" "Sometimes," she nodded solemnly. "My mum says stories are how we make the world less scary." We found Pickle 10 minutes later, snuffling around a tree stump. He barked once, then ran straight into the girl's arms. She hugged him like he was more than a dog, like he was a promise. As she turned to leave, she said, "You look like someone who used to be sad." I smiled, but it didn't reach all the way to my chest. After she left, I stood in the snow for a long time. The cold seeped through my boots, but I didn't move. I thought about the time I got lost in the supermarket when I was 5. I wandered away from the cart to look at the cereal aisle. When I turned back, Mum was gone. I panicked, started crying. People walked past me like I was invisible. But then I heard Dad's voice behind me, calm and sure. "There you are." He didn't scold. He just picked me up, carried me out and bought me a chocolate milk. Mum was furious, said I'd embarrassed her, said next time I should just stay close like a normal kid. I learned that day to stay small, stay quiet, stay near. I watched the trees sway in the distance and thought of how many times I'd done that since disappeared on purpose, so someone else wouldn't have to feel discomfort. Back inside, I picked up my phone. 5 more messages. A voicemail. I pressed play, but didn't hold it to my ear. Just listened to the faint crackle of my mother's voice across the kitchen counter. "We're worried," she said. "Becca's asking for you. Please, let's not make this harder than it already is." Harder. As if not being invited wasn't already enough. As if choosing peace meant I owed someone an explanation. I turned the phone off. No drama, no anger, just quiet. I sat back at the window and pulled the sweater tighter around me. The snow kept falling, covering everything in silence. And for once, I let it. Until the silence broke. The cabin phone rang an old landline mounted by the door I'd nearly forgotten about. I let it ring twice before I picked it up. "Eleanor?" It was Margot. Her voice was sharp, clipped the edge of panic just underneath. "Becca's gone. She's not answering. We don't know where she is. I didn't say anything." My grip tightened on the receiver. "She left a note," Margot continued. "It says," she paused, her breath catching. Then, "If Eleanor's not there, I can't go through with it." That's all it says. That's all we have. I could hear someone crying in the background. Maybe Mum. Maybe both of them. I stayed silent. "Eleanor," Margot said, voice shaking. "Now she needs you." I hung up, not cruelly, just quietly, like closing a book I wasn't ready to read. I sat there for a long time, staring at the cord, at the snow, at the way light moved through frost. I thought of Becca in middle school crying in the hallway after she failed a science quiz. I had found her hiding in the girls' bathroom, clutching the paper like it might burn her. Mum would lose it if she knew. So I took the quiz, crumpled it and tossed it in a trash bin outside. Told her to say she'd lost it. Later that night, I stayed up helping her rewrite it from memory. I never said a word to Mum. She never thanked me. But the next morning, she slipped her favourite bracelet into my backpack. That was her way. The next time I heard from them wasn't a call, it was an email. From Becca's account. No subject, no body. Just a single attachment, a photo. Us. From years ago. Becca, in her prom dress, me in my pyjamas, curled up beside her on the floor. She hadn't wanted to go. Said she felt fat and ugly. I stayed up all night playing music and doing her makeup until she laughed. She said I was better than the whole dance. We fell asleep on the floor. I'd forgotten that picture even existed. I stared at it for a long time. Then I checked the timestamp. The day before prom, I'd slipped a book into her backpack. A borrowed copy of The Bell Jar. Inside it, a letter I'd written but never sent addressed to our mom. It was all about invisibility, about what it felt like to be the reliable one, the unthanked one, the sister who edited essays and skipped parties and made sure everyone else made it to where they needed to be. I never meant for anyone to read it. I just needed it out of me. I thought it was gone, but there it was. The photo was her way of saying I found it, and I finally see you. I put the phone down. The snow outside had stopped. Everything was white and still, as if the world itself had paused. I opened the drawer where I kept the photo, the only copy I had. I looked at our faces side by side. We looked young, hopeful, tangled together like we still believed nothing could undo us. I closed my eyes and remembered the night before Becca's SATs. She'd panicked, said she couldn't breathe. I stayed up all night with her reading flashcards in a whisper while she drank tea and cried. She didn't take the test. No one asked why. I covered for her, said she had the flu. I always covered. I always disappeared so she could stay visible. But now she was gone. And I wasn't sure if that was her running towards something or finally away. Either way, it had my name in the middle of it. The wind picked up outside. I reached for the photo again. For the first time in years, I didn't feel erased. Just remembered. The phone vibrated on the windowsill where I'd left it hours ago. The screen lit up with a string of messages, texts, voicemails, missed calls. I didn't move at first, just watched them accumulate like digital snowdrifts. Then, I picked it up and scrolled. A voice note from Margot came first. Her tone was different, flat, like she'd been crying, but didn't want anyone to know. "I know you're reading these," she said, "and if you are, I need you to hear this. We were wrong. About everything. You were the best of us, and we erased you." Another one from Becca. No drama this time, no influencer voice, just her real voice. Small, tired. "I'm not okay without you. I know that's not fair to say, but it's true. There were more." Mum's voice uncertain for the first time I could remember. "Please, come home. We didn't mean to, but the message cut off there." A string of half apologies wrapped in bad reception. I listened to every single one, some twice. I didn't cry, didn't rage, just sat there, thumb hovering over the screen. There was a time I would have run back, cancelled the rest of the cabin stay, booked a last-minute ticket, shown up, makeup done, hair straightened, smile rehearsed, taken my place in the second row. Clapped for speeches I wrote, but never got credit for. Not this time. I didn't power down my phone out of anger. I did it because for the first time I knew I didn't need to show up to matter. I was already there in the cracks of their conversations, the silence behind their panic. I was in the missing piece they couldn't ignore anymore. The screen went dark. I set it face down on the table and left it there. That was my choice. Not absence out of spite, but presence on my terms. I made tea and sat by the window. The sweater I wore still had that little hole on the left sleeve. I'd meant to stitch it a dozen times, but now it felt honest. A flaw I'd stopped trying to hide. The last time I'd chosen silence was different. I was 17, and a letter came in the mail with my name on it. A scholarship offer from a writing programme in Vermont. I was stunned. I'd applied in secret. Poured myself into that application at night while Becca slept. The day it arrived, I brought the envelope to Mom, smiling like an idiot. She read it said nothing and tucked it behind a stack of bills. 2 weeks later, I asked about it. She said, "You don't need to run away to be someone. Just be useful here." I never mentioned it again, never replied to the offer. The deadline passed, and like that, the dream folded in on itself. I kept the rejection inside, learned to shrink, to be helpful, to write from the sidelines. But now, I was older, I had my voice back. Not loud, not dramatic, just mine. The darkness of the phone screen next to me was oddly comforting. A boundary, a line I didn't need to explain. I wasn't coming back to prove anything. I wasn't waiting for their next move. This was mine. The tea cooled. I scribbled a few lines in my notebook. Not a story, just a sentence, "I am still here." And for once, that felt like enough. I didn't know it then, but somewhere back home, the wedding was unraveling. Not in an explosive, dramatic way, but quietly, like the final threads of something that had never been truly whole. Ruth was the one who told me 2 days later. She knocked on my door with a mug of tea and said in her usual calm voice, "There's no wedding." She called it off. I stared at her. "Becca." That's what Margot told me she said, sitting down like she hadn't just dropped a bomb in the middle of my silence. I tried to picture it. Becca taking off the dress, unpinning her hair, whispering to someone that she couldn't do it. Ruth didn't offer more, and I didn't ask. That night, I opened my email for the first time in a week. Buried in the flood was a message from Mum. No subject line, no salutation, just this: he loved you best. I hated that. I see now what that made me do. If this is too late, I'll understand. But I needed to say it. There were no ellipses, no softening language, no deflection, just words that sounded like hers, but carried the weight of someone else, someone exhausted from holding on to denial. I read it over and over until the screen blurred. I didn't cry, not because it didn't mean something, but because it meant so much I couldn't hold it all yet. In the days that followed, Margot sent more messages. One was just a voice note. I talked to Dr. Kaplan today, she said. Therapist, first session. Turns out, I've been so busy being the responsible one that I forgot how to be honest. Her voice cracked. You were the best of us and we erased you. I'm so sorry. I listened twice. Didn't reply. Just let the words sit. Becca's social media went dark. All wedding content deleted. Her engagement post gone. The Pinterest boards locked. Jack disappeared too quietly. I imagined him packing his bags, not asking questions, maybe even relieved. No public statement. Just silence. Ruth came in one morning holding a paper. A poem yellowed at the edges. It reminded me of you, she said, and read it aloud. I wasn't there, but I was the reason it happened. I didn't speak, but the silence came from me. She looked at me afterward and said, You didn't destroy the wedding. You withdrew, and they had to hear the echo you left. I sat with that, let it sink in. One morning, I said yes to the local bookstore's invitation to lead a writing workshop. Nothing big. Just 6 women, mismatched chairs, a circle of notebooks and coffee cups. I gave them one prompt: write the chapter they tried to delete. A retired nurse wrote about her brother's funeral where no one mentioned her name. A young woman wrote about disappearing from group photos, always the one holding the camera. A mother of 2 said she once stopped talking during Zoom calls because no one asked how she was. I didn't lead. I just listened. And in their stories, I saw a mirror. Not exact, but parallel. Erasure has many faces. I wrote with them, slowly, in the margins of my notebook, on napkins, on the back of receipts. One sentence kept repeating, I am not the silence you built around me. The night before the final workshop, Ruth sat by the fire, knitting her never-finished blanket. I was holding Mum's letter again. Was she always like that with Grandma, I asked. Ruth paused. No. She was worse after Grandma died. She started using her pain like a compass. But it always pointed back at you girls. The legacy, not genetic, but taught, repeated. I wasn't there to fix it, but maybe by not showing up, I broke it. At the last session, I wrote on the board in chalk, write the chapter they tried to delete. No one asked who they was. Everyone already knew. The next morning, there was a package on the porch. No return address, just my name written in a familiar slanted print. I didn't recognize the handwriting until I opened it. Inside, a slim book with a matte cover. Pale, grey, minimalist, the title in soft ink, The Sister You Forgot. I froze. The font, it matched Dad's old handwriting. The curves of the S, the tiny hook on the G. She must have used one of his old letters for reference. My chest tightened. I sat down, right there on the porch step, the cold seeping through the wood, and turned to the first page. No preface, no dedication, just a note in her messy scrawl. I won't ask you to forgive me. I'm just learning to remember you. There were more words, but that one line hit like the kind of apology that doesn't try to earn back your love. It just wants to say, I finally see you. I ran my fingers over the cover again. I didn't cry, I just held it close and breathed. Ruth walked by, saw me on the step and nodded. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. I flipped through the pages slowly. Chapter 3. The Night of the Window. It was a story I thought no one remembered. The time Becca climbed out the window to skip a party and came home crying because her crush had mocked her dress. I was the one who covered for her, told Mom she was with me the whole time. Becca had written she didn't say, I told you so. She just made hot cocoa and sat beside me until I stopped shaking. I never thought that night mattered to anyone but me. Tucked inside the back flap was a short letter folded twice. I wrote this with my mistakes it began, the parts I left out on purpose, the edits I made to my memory. You were always there, but I edited you out because you didn't fit the story I thought the world wanted. Now I'm trying to write a new one and you're on every page. It was strange reading your own absence. The scene she described the night she got drunk at a college party and called me to pick her up. The time she got food poisoning and I stayed up pressing cool cloths to her forehead. Even the little things like our Halloween routines, the way I used to carve the pumpkins while she picked the seeds clean. She remembered. Or maybe now she allowed herself to. Later that evening, I took the book to Ruth. She turned it over in her hands, nodding slowly. They don't write books for people they forget, she said, then placed it gently on the table like it was something sacred. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. That night, I lay in bed, holding the book to my chest. I remembered another time years ago when I told Mom I wanted to teach creative writing. She had looked over her glasses and said, teaching people to write won't pay your rent. I had buried the dream quietly, like a letter never sent. But now, with my own workshops with women showing up every week to reclaim their voices, I felt something settle. Like the dream had waited long enough and decided to live anyway. I opened my journal, took out Dad's old fountain pen from the drawer and wrote in the margin of Becca's book she remembered. The ink bled a little, but it felt right. The next morning I shared a passage with the class. No names, just her words. One woman raised her hand. Do you think she regrets it? I think I said carefully, she regrets not remembering sooner. But she's trying now. That counts. After they left, Ruth handed me a small envelope. Inside was a dried daisy. Your dad gave me that once, she said it reminded him of you. I found it in an old book. I nodded, placing it between the pages of The Sister You Forgot. I stood by the window, that night snow falling again, softer this time. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel erased, just included, quietly, permanently, in a story that finally remembered me. I sat by the window as the sky turned pale blue, that early kind of light that makes snow glow instead of just reflect. The book still rested on my chest from the night before, and Dad's letter lay open on the side table. I hadn't read it in a while, not since the cabin's first night, but something about finishing Becca's book made me want to go back not to mourn, but to anchor. His handwriting was uneven, rushed but warm, like he didn't want to lose the thought before it disappeared. You always had a place. Don't let them forget it. I read it again out loud this time, and it didn't make me cry. It made me breathe deeper, like his words had filled in a lung I hadn't used in years. Later that day in the workshop, I asked the class to write about the person in their family whose story was never told. Lena, the woman who had once shared how no one remembered her during pandemic. Zoom spoke again. When I was 12, she said I edited myself out of a family photo before we printed it. I just thought I didn't belong in it. Her voice didn't shake. She just looked around, daring someone to say they didn't understand. No one did. They all understood. I had them write for 10 minutes. Most stayed another 20. After class, Ruth came in with tea. We sat by the fireplace where her unfinished blanket still waited in its basket. She didn't speak right away, just handed me a letter she never sent to an old friend. We all have drafts, she said, not just on paper. I nodded. I think I'm finally ready to finish mine. That night, I reread Becca's memoir. Some of the chapters were raw, even clumsy, but honest. She wrote about skipping the SATs and how I stayed up with her all night. About the lipstick I gave her, which she once mocked, but now called her first real gift. About a time I carried her literally when she twisted her ankle before a recital and our mum told her to tough it out. Elena never asked for credit, she wrote, and that made her the easiest person to forget. I closed the book slowly, then opened Dad's letter one more time. I imagined him reading Becca's pages, nodding. Not because everything was fixed, but because it was finally acknowledged. I took his old fountain pen, the one I'd kept all these years, and signed my name on a short essay I had been too scared to submit for publication. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And now it was sent. Before bed, I tore a page from my journal and wrote a line in large, steady letters. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is choose absence. I taped it to the window. Underneath, I added, "Write your story," the one they tried to erase. The next morning, I walked to the local library with a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was Becca's book. I didn't sign my name. I just wrote on the first page, "If you've ever been erased, this story is also yours." Then I slipped it into the returns bin. It would be shelved anonymously. But maybe someone would find it. Maybe it would matter. Back at the cabin, Ruth smiled when she saw me by the fire. "You look taller today," she said. I laughed. "I haven't grown in a decade." She tilted her head. "Not like that." As the final workshop began, I stood at the board and picked up the chalk. I wrote slowly, deliberately, write the chapter they tried to delete. No one asked who they was. They didn't need to. This time, everyone already knew. And as I sat back down, watching snow start to fall again outside, I finally understood what it meant to be present. Not needed. Not praised. Just remembered. Not every erasure is permanent. Some just need a voice brave enough to fill the silence. And maybe that's you too. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, cut out of a celebration passed over without reason, remembered only for what you didn't do, you're not alone. There are more of us than you think. People walking around with pages missing, waiting for someone to hand them the pen. Today, more and more are choosing quiet places like this to heal cabins, support circles, writing groups, even anonymous podcasts. They aren't loud about their pain, but they're done pretending it didn't happen. And slowly they're building something back, starting with truth, however soft it begins. So if this story felt familiar, maybe it's time you write yours too, or speak it, or whisper it just to yourself for now. That counts. You count. And if you want more stories like this, stories that don't scream, but stay with you, subscribe to the channel. Not just for content, but for company. Because some of us weren't erased. We were just waiting for the right chapter to begin. You're here now, and that matters.